when the massive alien vessels descended from the stars, casting shadows over Earth's greatest cities. Every government on the planet held its breath. The Galactic Council's message was simple, delivered in perfect human languages through every communication device simultaneously. Welcome to the Galactic community. Your tribute assessment begins now. For 3,000 years, every species that encountered the Council followed the same pattern. Submit to evaluation. Accept their assigned role. Pay tribute in resources, technology, or servitude. The strong became enforcers. The intelligent became administrators. The weak became laborers. It was the natural order of a galaxy that had known peace through hierarchy for millennia. But the Council had never encountered humans before. They expected fear. They received curiosity. They demanded submission. They got questions. They offered roles in their cosmic hierarchy. Humanity politely declined and suggested coffee instead. What happened next would rewrite the fundamental rules that govern galactic civilization, challenge the very concept of tribute and hierarchy, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous response to overwhelming power isn't resistance. It's an invitation to sit down and talk it through. This is the story of how humanity's greatest strength wasn't our technology, our weapons, or our courage. It was something far more terrifying to a galaxy built on rigid order. Our complete inability to accept that this is how things have always been was a good enough reason for anything. The shadows fell across New York City at precisely noon Eastern Time, though clocks meant little when ships the size of mountains blocked out the sun. Ambassador Sarah Chun pressed her palm against the cool glass of the United Nations building's 42nd floor, watching humanity's first official extraterrestrial contact unfold in the most mundane way possible, with a parking problem. The lead vessel, a crystalline structure that seemed to bend light around its edges, hovered exactly where international airspace regulations said it shouldn't. Fighter jets circled at a respectful distance, their pilots probably wondering if their weapons could even scratch something that large. Sarah doubted it mattered. If these beings wanted to destroy Earth, they wouldn't have announced their arrival with what amounted to a cosmic cease and desist order. Ma'am, they're requesting to speak with the dominant authority figures of this planetary system. Lieutenant Williams, her aide, held up a tablet displaying real-time translations of the alien transmission. They've been saying the same thing in every major language for the past 6 minutes. Sarah turned from the window, straightening her blazer. 20 years of diplomatic service had prepared her for difficult negotiations, but never with beings who could travel between stars. Have they landed? No, ma'am. They're just waiting. The Secretary General wants to know if you're ready for the initial contact protocol. She almost laughed. Initial contact protocol. As if anyone had more than theoretical frameworks for this moment. Every contingency plan assumed either hostile invasion or benevolent guidance. None had accounted for what appeared to be a bureaucratic process. Tell the Secretary General we're as ready as anyone can be for something impossible, Sarah said, moving toward the elevator. And, Lieutenant, make sure recording devices are active. Whatever happens next, the world needs to see it. The main assembly hall had been hastily converted into humanity's reception room for the stars. Representatives from nearly every nation sat in tense silence, their usual political divisions momentarily forgotten in the face of something that transcended earthly concerns. Sarah took her place at the central podium, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The air shimmered. There was no dramatic materialization, no flash of light or sound of machinery. One moment the space before the podium was empty. The next it contained 3 beings that made Sarah's mind struggle to process what she was seeing. The central figure stood roughly 8 feet tall, its body a flowing combination of what looked like liquid metal and crystalline structures. Where a face might be, geometric patterns shifted and pulsed with soft blue light. Its companions were smaller, but no less alien. One resembled a walking tree made of silver branches, while the other appeared to be a collection of floating geometric shapes that maintained a vaguely humanoid configuration. Greetings, representatives of species designation human, Terra Sol 3. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, each word perfectly enunciated in what Sarah recognized as formal diplomatic English. I am Arbitrator Junka of the Galactic Council. These are my colleagues, Assessor Vorth Nil and Evaluator Quex Prime. The assembly remained silent. Sarah had been chosen to speak for humanity, not because she was the highest-ranking diplomat present, but because she'd spent her career defusing situations where different cultures collided. This was just a more extreme version of the same challenge. "Welcome to Earth, Arbitrator Jun Ka," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall speakers. "I'm Ambassador Sarah Chun, representing the United Nations of Earth. We're honored by your visit, though I confess we're uncertain about the purpose of your arrival." The patterns on Jun Ka's face region shifted, possibly indicating surprise. "The purpose is standard galactic integration protocol, Ambassador Chun. Your species has achieved sufficient technological development to warrant inclusion in the Council's territorial administration. We are here to conduct your tribute assessment and assign your species' role within the galactic hierarchy." Sarah felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Every word spoken in this room would be analyzed by future generations. The response she gave would shape humanity's relationship with a galaxy full of advanced civilizations. "I appreciate the explanation, Arbitrator, but I think there might be some confusion about our expectations for this meeting," Sarah said carefully. "Could you elaborate on what you mean by tribute assessment and species role assignment?" The tree-like being, Assessor Vorthnil, moved forward with motions that reminded Sarah of wind through branches. When it spoke, its voice carried the sound of rustling leaves. "Standard procedure for all newly contacted species. Assessment of technological capabilities, resource availability, population dynamics, and cultural adaptability. Based on these factors, species are assigned optimal roles: resource extraction, manufacturing, research support, military enforcement, administrative assistance, or cultural preservation." "In tribute?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Evaluator Quexprime's floating components rearranged themselves before responding in a voice like chiming crystals. "Tribute ensures species participation in galactic stability, technology transfer, resource allocation, population contribution to Council projects. Standard rates: 15% of technological output, 25% of rare mineral extraction, 30% of advanced manufacturing capability." The numbers hit Sarah like physical blows. She could hear the sharp intake of breath from delegates behind her, the whispered translations as the implications became clear. These beings weren't here to invite humanity into some cosmic community of equals. They were here to collect taxes from a species they'd already decided was their property. "Arbitrator Jin Ka," Sarah said, keeping her voice level despite the anger building in her chest. "I need to understand something. Are you informing us of these requirements, or are you negotiating with us about them?" The crystalline being's patterns shifted again. "I'm uncertain of the distinction, Ambassador Chun. The requirements are standard galactic law, established through 3 millennia of peaceful coexistence between member species. There is no mechanism for negotiation, only assessment and implementation." Sarah looked back at her fellow delegates. She saw fear in many faces, but also something else: the same stubborn determination that had driven humans to climb mountains simply because they were there, to sail into unknown oceans because the horizon called to them, to reach for the stars because they refused to accept that Earth was the limit of their dreams. "Well then," Sarah said, turning back to face beings who commanded the loyalty of 1,000 worlds, "we might have our first problem. Because negotiation isn't just a mechanism for us. It's a fundamental principle. We don't accept arbitrary authority, regardless of how long it's been in place or how many others have accepted it." The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of challenge. Sarah could almost see the moment when these representatives of galactic order realized that humanity wasn't going to fit neatly into their categories. Jinka's patterns flickered rapidly, possibly indicating confusion or concern. "Ambassador Chun, I believe there may be a misunderstanding about your species' position in this process. Resistance to Council authority is not customary. The benefits of compliance far outweigh the consequences of defiance." "And what would those consequences be?" Sarah asked. "Economic isolation from galactic trade networks. Exclusion from technological exchange programs. Assignment of species role through alternative means rather than voluntary cooperation." Sarah felt a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the gravity of the situation. "Arbitrator, with respect, those sound less like consequences and more like offers we're declining. Vorthnil's branches swayed with what might have been agitation. Ambassador Chun, perhaps your species requires additional time to consider the implications of council membership. The benefits are substantial: protection from hostile species, access to advanced technology, integration into a stable galactic economy. Those do sound beneficial, Sarah agreed. But they also sound like things we'd prefer to earn rather than pay tribute for. What if we proposed a different arrangement entirely? The three alien representatives exchanged communications through methods Sarah couldn't perceive, probably quantum entanglement or some other technology that made their ancient radios look like smoke signals. When they refocused on her, their postures seemed somehow more attentive. What alternative do you propose? Jinka asked. Sarah took a breath, knowing that her next words would either open unprecedented possibilities or doom humanity to conflict with powers beyond their comprehension. Partnership, not membership, not tribute, not role assignment. Partnership between equals, where both sides contribute what they're best at, and both sides benefit from the exchange. Quex Prime's components rearranged themselves into a configuration that somehow conveyed skepticism. Partnership requires comparable capabilities, Ambassador Chun. Your species has achieved basic space travel and rudimentary energy manipulation. The Council commands resources spanning 37 galaxy sectors. That's exactly why partnership makes sense, Sarah replied. You have vast resources and advanced technology, but you're managing them through a tribute system that's remained unchanged for 3,000 years. We have something you clearly haven't encountered much of: innovation born from necessity, creativity driven by limitations, and an absolute refusal to accept that this is how we've always done it is sufficient justification for anything. She gestured toward the assembled delegates. Every human in this room represents a species that looked at an impossible challenge and decided to solve it anyway. We've turned poisonous environments into gardens, split atoms to power cities, sent machines to other planets just to see what was there. Not because we had unlimited resources, but because we didn't. Jinka's patterns had slowed to a steady pulse. You speak of innovation as though it is absent from galactic civilization. I'm sure innovation exists, Sarah said. But innovation within a stable hierarchy tends to focus on refinement rather than revolution. When was the last time someone in your council proposed completely restructuring how galactic civilization operates? The silence stretched long enough for Sarah to worry she'd overplayed her hand. Then, Vorthnil spoke, its voice carrying a note she hadn't heard before. Such proposals are considered destabilizing. Exactly, Sarah said. And that's what we're offering. Not destabilization for its own sake, but the willingness to question fundamental assumptions when they stop serving their intended purpose. You've achieved peace through hierarchy, which is remarkable. But what happens when new challenges arise that can't be solved by maintaining the existing order? Evaluator Quex Prime's components formed what might have been a gesture of interest. What specific capabilities does your species offer that would justify partnership status rather than standard integration? Sarah felt the attention of every human in the room focusing on her answer. This was the moment where she either convinced galactic powers to try something unprecedented or set humanity on a collision course with forces that could erase their entire civilization. We solve problems no one thought were problems, she said simply. We see opportunities in situations others consider stable. We make connections between seemingly unrelated concepts that lead to breakthrough innovations. And, most importantly, we never stop asking, what if we tried something completely different? She paused, then decided to take the biggest risk of her life. For instance, right now you're thinking about this conversation in terms of whether we'll comply with your system or be forced into it. But what if there's a third option? What if the real question is whether your system is ready to evolve into something better? The alien representatives went completely still. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat in the sudden silence, could feel the tension radiating from every human delegate in the room. She just challenged the fundamental structure that had governed galactic civilization for longer than human recorded history. When Junka finally spoke, its voice carried new undertones that Sarah couldn't interpret. Ambassador Chun, are you suggesting that the Galactic Council's governmental structure requires modification? I'm suggesting that any system that hasn't changed in 3,000 years might benefit from some fresh perspective, Sarah replied. And I'm proposing that humanity could provide that perspective, not as subjects or tribute payers, but as partners invested in improving something we'd be part of. Vorthnil's branches moved in complex patterns. This approach is unprecedented. Good, Sarah said with a smile that surprised even her. Unprecedented is what we do best. The crystalline being's patterns shifted to rapid, chaotic movements. Ambassador Chun, the Council will require time to consider your proposal. This conversation has introduced variables that do not exist within our established protocols. Take all the time you need, Sarah replied. But while you're considering it, perhaps we could start with something smaller. Have your people ever experienced human hospitality? I mean, really experienced it. Not just formal diplomatic exchange. Quexprime's shapes formed what might have been confusion. What do you mean by hospitality? Sarah's smile widened. I mean dinner. Actual food, prepared by people who enjoy cooking for others. Conversation without formal protocols. The chance to see how humans interact when we're not trying to impress anyone or achieve specific objectives. The three aliens exchanged another burst of imperceptible communication. When they refocused on Sarah, Jean Ka's patterns had settled into something that might have been curiosity. You are proposing social interaction without diplomatic purpose? I'm proposing social interaction where the purpose is just to get to know each other, Sarah corrected. Because partnership requires trust, and trust requires understanding who you're actually dealing with rather than just their official position. Vorthnil's voice carried what sounded almost like amusement. This is highly irregular, Ambassador Chun. Arbitrator Jean Ka, Sarah said, addressing the lead representative directly. In your 3,000 years of galactic administration, how many species have invited you to dinner? The pause before the answer told Sarah everything she needed to know. None, Jean Ka admitted. Then, you've never seen what humans are actually like, Sarah said. And we've never seen what you're like when you're not delivering ultimatums. Seems like useful information for both sides to have. The alien representatives conferred again, this time long enough for Sarah to wonder if she'd pushed too far too fast. But when they turned back to her, something in their postures had shifted. Ambassador Chun, Jean Ka said, the council delegation will accept your invitation to dinner. However, we must inform you that our assessment of your species will continue during any social interaction. Fair enough, Sarah replied. But be warned, our assessment of you will be continuing too. And humans have a tendency to form strong opinions about people who share our food. As the alien representatives shimmered and disappeared, presumably returning to their ships, Sarah realized that she'd just committed humanity to the most important dinner party in the history of the species. Around her, delegates erupted into excited conversation, but she remained focused on the window overlooking the massive ships still hovering over Earth cities. Somewhere in those crystalline vessels, beings with the power to reshape worlds were trying to figure out how to process a species that had just turned a tribute assessment into a dinner invitation. Sarah hoped humanity's cooks were ready for the challenge of their lives. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the air outside the United Nations building as Chef Maria Santos supervised the preparation of what she'd privately dubbed the dinner that could save the world. 3 hours had passed since Ambassador Chin's unprecedented invitation, and somehow the weight of representing all of human cuisine had fallen on a woman who'd started her career cooking for construction workers in Sao Paulo. Chef, the alien delegates have specific atmospheric requirements, Lieutenant Williams called out, consulting his tablet while dodging servers carrying steaming dishes. Their respiratory systems can handle our air, but they've requested environmental controls be set to maintain optimal comfort for extended interaction. Maria wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at the makeshift dining area that had been assembled in the UN's main courtyard. Round tables instead of the formal rectangular configurations used for diplomatic dinners. Warm lighting instead of harsh fluorescence. Fresh flowers, and the sound of water from the central fountain instead of sterile conference room ambience. What's optimal comfort for beings made of living crystal and walking trees? She asked. Apparently, slightly higher humidity and a background resonance frequency that helps them process complex information. Williams looked up from his tablet. Also, they've never experienced taste before. Maria stopped stirring the sauce for the grilled salmon. Come again. They consume energy directly, not through digestion. The concept of flavor is completely foreign to them. A slow smile spread across Maria's face. Lieutenant, you just told me I get to introduce alien ambassadors to their first taste of food. Do you have any idea how remarkable that is? Williams blinked. I imagine it's significant. Significant, Maria laughed, returning to her preparations with renewed energy. It's the opportunity of several lifetimes. Flavor isn't just about nutrition. It's about memory, emotion, culture, creativity. When someone tastes something delicious for the first time, they're experiencing one of the most fundamentally human pleasures. She gestured toward the array of dishes being prepared by her hastily assembled international team of chefs. We've got representatives from every major culinary tradition on Earth here. Brazilian feijoada, Indian butter chicken, Italian pasta, Japanese sushi, Mexican mole, Ethiopian injera, French coq au vin, American barbecue. If we're going to show them what humanity is about, we're showing them all of it. Ambassador Chun approached, having traded her formal diplomatic attire for something that suggested elegant dinner party rather than interstellar negotiation. The change was deliberate. Every detail of this evening was designed to demonstrate that humans were more than just another species to be cataloged and assign a role. How are we coming along, Chef Santos? Sarah asked, accepting a small sample spoon of the mole sauce. We're ready to blow their minds, Maria replied with confidence. Or whatever they have instead of minds. The question is whether they're ready for us. Before Sarah could respond, the air shimmered with the same effect they'd witnessed in the assembly hall. The three alien representatives materialized near the courtyard entrance, their forms somehow less imposing in the softer lighting. Behind them came two additional figures Sarah hadn't seen before, a being that resembled a collection of flowing silk ribbons in rainbow colors, and what appeared to be a walking sculpture made of polished black stone. Ambassador Chun. Arbitrator Junka's voice carried the same formal tone as before, but something in the patterns shifting across its crystalline surface suggested uncertainty. We have arrived for the proposed social interaction. These are technical advisor Lyth Senna and cultural observer Grixtor, who requested permission to attend. Sarah approached with a welcoming smile. The more the better. I'm glad you could bring colleagues. It means you're taking this seriously. Evaluator Quaxprime's floating components arranged themselves in a configuration that might have indicated confusion. Ambassador Chun, we must clarify. We are not certain what taking this seriously means in this context. It means you're willing to experience something new instead of just analyzing it, Sarah replied, gesturing toward the prepared dining area. Come on, let me introduce you to the team that's going to change your entire understanding of what humans are capable of. As the group moved toward the tables, Sarah caught sight of the alien representatives taking in their surroundings with what could only be described as intense focus. Their attention lingered on details that might seem inconsequential to humans. The way candlelight reflected off water, the sound of quiet conversations mixing with ambient music, the informal arrangement of seating that encouraged interaction rather than hierarchy. Chef Santos approached with the confidence of someone who'd spent her life turning simple ingredients into moments of joy. Honored guests, I'm Maria Santos, and it's my privilege to introduce you to human cuisine. Before we begin, I need to understand. Do your species have any physical limitations I should be aware of regarding consumption? Technical advisor Lyth Senna's ribbon-like form rippled with colors that shifted from blue to golden yellow. We can absorb molecular compositions through contact with our external membranes. However, we do not understand the purpose of consuming matter that provides no energy benefit. Maria's eyes lit up with the fervor of someone about to share her greatest passion. Energy benefit is just one function of food. For humans, eating is also about pleasure, social bonding, cultural identity, artistic expression, and emotional comfort. Food tells stories. She gestured to the nearest table, where small samples of various dishes had been artfully arranged. This is why we don't just consume nutrients efficiently. We take something necessary for survival and transform it into an experience that engages all our senses and connects us to our history, our communities, and our creativity. Cultural observer Grixtor's stone form seemed to lean forward with interest. You are saying that consumption serves social and cultural functions beyond nutritional requirements. Exactly, Sarah interjected, taking a seat at the table and encouraging the aliens to join her. In human societies, sharing food is how we welcome strangers, celebrate achievements, comfort the grieving, and strengthen relationships. Some of our most important cultural and religious practices center around communal meals, as the alien representatives position themselves around the table, a process that involves some fascinating adaptations to furniture designed for entirely different body types. Maria began her carefully planned introduction to human cuisine. "We'll start with something simple," she announced, placing small portions of fresh bread with butter in front of each guest. "This is grain that's been fermented, heated, and transformed into something completely different from its original form. The butter is made from milk produced by domesticated animals." Assessor Vorthnil's branch-like appendages moved hesitantly toward the bread. "The consumption process involves, for humans, we use our teeth to break down the food, then our digestive systems extract nutrients," Sarah explained. "For you, I believe you can absorb the molecular structure directly through contact. But the important part isn't how you process it. It's what you experience while doing so." Watching beings who had never encountered flavor experience taste for the first time was, Maria would later reflect, like watching someone discover music after a lifetime of silence. The patterns on Junka's crystalline surface began shifting through color spectrums Sarah hadn't seen before. Light Senna's ribbons fluttered with increasingly rapid color changes. Grixtor's stone form seemed to resonate with a barely audible harmonic frequency. "This is unexpected." Quexprime's floating components had rearranged into an entirely new configuration. The molecular composition contains information beyond nutritional content. "What kind of information?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their perspective. Vorthnil's voice carried wonder that transcended species barriers. "Complexity created through transformation. History of growth, harvest, preparation. Intentional modification to achieve pleasure." Maria nodded enthusiastically. "Now you're getting it. But we're just getting started." What followed was 3 hours that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human-galactic relations, though none of the participants fully understood that at the time. As dish after dish was presented, the alien representatives began demonstrating reactions that their diplomatic protocols had never anticipated. The spicy heat of the Mexican mole caused technical advisor Life Senna's ribbons to flash with rapid red pulses that gradually settled into warm orange waves. The complex umami of a Japanese miso soup made cultural observer Grixtor's stone-form ring like a bell with harmonic frequencies that created an oddly musical background to the conversation. "Explain the purpose of this sensation," arbitrator Junka requested after experiencing the Italian pasta with its rich tomato and herb sauce. "It provides minimal nutritional value, but triggers significant response patterns in our sensory matrices." Chef Santos grinned. "That's what we call delicious. The purpose is joy." "Joy," Vorthnil repeated, as if testing the concept. "A positive emotional response triggered by sensory experience that serves no survival function?" "Well, it does serve a survival function," Sarah corrected gently. "Just not an individual one. When humans enjoy food together, it builds social bonds that help our community survive and thrive. When we take pleasure in creating and sharing meals, it encourages the cooperation and creativity that have always been our greatest strengths." As the evening progressed, something remarkable began happening. The alien representatives started asking questions that went far beyond their original assessment protocols. They wanted to know why humans had developed so many different cooking techniques. They were fascinated by the concept of recipes being passed down through generations, carrying cultural knowledge and family memories. When Maria explained that the Brazilian feijoada they were sampling had its origins in Portuguese colonial history, but had been transformed by African culinary traditions and indigenous ingredients, creating something uniquely Brazilian, evaluator Quexprime asked a question that surprised everyone. "This suggests that your species views cultural fusion as beneficial rather than threatening?" "Generally, yes," Sarah replied. "Humans tend to believe that combining the best elements of different approaches creates something better than any single tradition alone." Light Senna's ribbons shifted to deep purple hues. "This perspective is not common among galactic species. Most cultures seek to preserve their distinctiveness rather than integrate with others. That might be why your tribute system works for them, but feels wrong to us," Sarah observed. We're not trying to preserve our distinctiveness from you. We're curious about what we might become if we combined our approaches with yours. The conversation that followed moved seamlessly between discussions of food, culture, history, and governance. The alien representatives shared information about their own species' backgrounds. Jinka's people were crystalline beings who had evolved in the heart of a gas giant, processing energy directly from electromagnetic fields. Vorthnil's tree-like species had developed on a planet where cooperation between plant and animal life forms had become so integrated that individual identity was secondary to collective consciousness. As the evening drew toward its close, Grixtor posed a question that cut to the heart of everything they discussed. Ambassador Chun, your species appears to derive satisfaction from activities that require significant effort but provide no essential benefit. The preparation of this meal required substantial resources and time that could have been allocated to more efficient purposes. Why do you consider this worthwhile? Sarah looked around the table at alien beings who were experiencing pleasure for what might be the first time, who had spent hours engaged in conversation that had no formal agenda or predetermined outcomes, who had demonstrated curiosity and wonder instead of just conducting an assessment. Because efficiency isn't the highest human value, she said simply. Connection is. Understanding is. Beauty is. The experience of sharing something wonderful with others is. We don't want to just survive, we want to live. And life, for humans, means constantly discovering new ways to find joy and meaning in existence. She gestured to the remnants of their extraordinary meal. This dinner didn't serve any essential survival function, but it created something that didn't exist before: friendship between species that have never encountered each other, understanding between cultures that operate on completely different principles, the possibility of cooperation based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical authority. Jinka's patterns had settled into a steady, warm glow. Ambassador Chun, this experience has introduced concepts that do not fit within our existing frameworks for interspecies relations. Good, Maria interjected with a laugh. The best meals always leave you wanting to try something new. Technical advisor Lythe Senna's ribbons flowed in graceful spirals. We must inform you that our assessment of your species has become complicated. How so? Sarah asked. Vorthnil's branches swayed gently. Your technological capabilities remain limited. Your resource base is modest. Your population is small relative to galactic standards. However, your cultural innovations and social adaptability exceed our evaluation parameters. Which brings us back to our original proposition, Sarah said. Partnership instead of tribute. The chance to contribute what we're actually good at instead of being forced into roles that don't suit us. Cultural observer Grixtor's harmonic resonance had shifted to something that sounded almost like contentment. The council will require extensive deliberation regarding your proposal. However, we must acknowledge that this evening has demonstrated capabilities that our standard assessment protocols do not measure. As the alien representatives prepared to depart, Arbitrator Jinka turned back to Sarah with a request that surprised her. Ambassador Chun, would it be possible to obtain recipes for our records? Sarah smiled. Of course, but recipes are just the beginning. The real magic happens when you start experimenting, adapting them to your own tastes and circumstances, making them your own. As the shimmering air marked the departure of their guests, Sarah and Maria stood in the courtyard, surrounded by the remnants of the most important dinner party in human history. Think it worked? Maria asked, beginning to stack empty plates. Sarah looked up at the massive ships still hovering over Earth's cities, their crystalline surfaces now seeming less ominous and more curious. I think we just proved that humans have something to offer a galaxy that's been doing things the same way for 3,000 years, she said. Whether they're brave enough to accept the offer, that's what we'll find out next. 3 days after the dinner that had left the Galactic Council delegation struggling to process new concepts, Arbitrator Jinka stood before the High Assembly on the Council's primary administrative station, a structure that had grown organically over millennia into something resembling a metallic flower the size of a small moon. The assembly chamber itself could have held Earth's entire population, its crystalline walls displaying holographic representations of the 37 member sectors and their respective hierarchies. The assessment of species human Terra Sol 3 has encountered complications. Zheng Ka reported, its crystalline form pulsing with patterns that indicated deep uncertainty. Around the vast chamber, representatives of hundreds of species observed through various sensory methods, some visual, others electromagnetic, many operating on spectrums that had no human equivalent. High Counselor Vextherin, an ancient being whose gaseous form was contained within a complex metallic framework, responded with gravitational pulses that translated as disapproval. Complications are not acceptable in standard assessment procedures, arbitrator. Clarify the nature of these irregularities. Zheng Ka's patterns shifted to rapid, chaotic movements as it attempted to convey experiences that had no precedent in galactic diplomatic protocols. The species has refused standard integration procedures and proposed alternative arrangements. A ripple of confusion spread through the assembly. In 3,000 years of galactic administration, species either accepted council authority or were classified as hostile and dealt with accordingly. Alternative arrangements weren't part of the established framework. Counselor Revmodin, whose crystalline species had been among the first to join the council hierarchy, projected sharp geometric patterns that indicated skepticism. Define alternative arrangements, arbitrator. They have proposed partnership rather than tribute, Zheng Ka replied, causing the chamber to fall into absolute silence. They claim to offer capabilities that justify equal status rather than subordinate membership. The silence stretched until High Counselor Vextherin's gravitational emissions became noticeably agitated. Arbitrator Zheng Ka, are you reporting that a pre-FTL species with limited resource access has demanded equal status with the Galactic Council? Not demanded. Technical advisor Lythsena interjected, its ribbon-like form shifting through colors that indicated complexity beyond simple categorization. They invited us to consider mutual benefit rather than hierarchical extraction. Cultural observer Grixtor's stone form resonated with harmonics that carried undertones of fascination. The species demonstrates innovation patterns that exceed our analytical frameworks. Their approach to social organization, resource utilization, and cultural development suggests capabilities that traditional assessments cannot measure. Counselor Kephalon, representing one of the galaxy's primary military enforcement species, projected aggressive territorial displays. Capabilities are irrelevant if they cannot be properly integrated into existing structures. The hierarchy exists because it functions efficiently. Individual species preferences cannot supersede system stability. Assessor Vorthnil's branch-like appendages moved in patterns that suggested deep contemplation. Respectfully, Counselor Kephalon, the humans raise questions about whether our system continues to function as efficiently as we assume. The chamber erupted in communications across multiple spectrums as hundreds of species attempted to process this unprecedented challenge to galactic orthodoxy. High Counselor Vextherin's gravitational emissions created local distortions in space-time that served as the equivalent of pounding a gavel. Order. Explain this assertion, Assessor Vorthnil. Vorthnil's voice carried the cautious tone of someone presenting ideas that might be considered heretical. The humans questioned the logic of maintaining unchanged systems for extended periods. They suggested that innovation requires the willingness to modify existing approaches when new circumstances arise. The circumstances have not changed, Counselor Revmodin projected with sharp, dismissive patterns. The Council has maintained galactic peace and prosperity for 3 millennia through consistent application of proven hierarchical principles. What new circumstances could possibly justify fundamental systemic modification? Zheng Ka's patterns shifted to something that resembled hesitation. The humans themselves represent a new circumstance. Their social development patterns do not conform to any of our established species categories. They appear to have achieved technological advancement through cooperation rather than dominance, cultural fusion rather than preservation, and innovation rather than optimization. Lythsena's ribbons flowed through a spectrum of colors that indicated growing excitement. Their approach to problem-solving demonstrated capabilities we have not encountered. When presented with our standard integration requirements, instead of either compliance or resistance, they created a third option that had not previously existed. They invited us to experience social interaction without predetermined objectives, Grixtor added, its harmonic resonance carrying notes of wonder. The concept of deriving satisfaction from activities that serve no essential function but create interpersonal connections and cultural exchange. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions indicated deep skepticism. You are describing inefficiency as though it were beneficial. Perhaps efficiency is not the optimal primary value for all circumstances, Vorth Nil suggested carefully. The humans achieve remarkable results through processes that appear inefficient but generate innovation and adaptation capabilities that exceed their theoretical limits. The chamber fell silent again as hundreds of species processed the implications of what was being suggested. For 3,000 years, galactic civilization had been built on the principle that efficiency through hierarchy created the best outcomes for the greatest number of beings. The idea that there might be superior alternatives was fundamentally threatening to the entire structure of their society. Counselor Korth Prime, representing a hive mind species that had contributed significantly to council administrative efficiency, communicated through quantum-entangled thoughts that translated as cold logic. Even accepting the premise that these humans possess unusual innovation capabilities, they remain technologically primitive and resource-limited. What could they possibly contribute to advanced galactic civilization that would justify abandoning proven tribute systems? Junka's patterns shifted to something that might have indicated hope mixed with uncertainty. During our interaction, they demonstrated the ability to transform basic materials into complex experiences that generated previously unknown sensory responses. They created social connections between species that had never communicated. They identified potential improvements to systems that we had considered optimized. Elaborate on these potential improvements, demanded Counselor Kephalon with aggressive interest. Technical advisor Lythesena's ribbons rippled with nervous energy. The humans suggested that our tribute system might be less effective than voluntary cooperation because tribute creates incentive for minimal compliance rather than maximum contribution. They proposed that species allowed to pursue their natural strengths would contribute more value through willing partnership than through enforced role assignment. The implications of this suggestion sent waves of communication throughout the assembly as representatives calculated the potential ramifications. If the humans were correct, then the Council's entire economic and political structure might be fundamentally suboptimal. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions grew increasingly unstable. These are theoretical propositions with no practical evidence. The current system has demonstrably maintained stability across galactic civilization. But has it optimized potential? Grixtor asked with harmonic frequencies that carried subtle challenge. The humans raised the question of whether stability and optimization are the same thing. Cultural observer Grixtor activated holographic displays showing data compilations from the Council's vast archives. I have been analyzing historical patterns since our interaction with the humans. Innovation rates across member species have declined consistently over the past millennium. Resource utilization efficiency has plateaued. Cultural development has essentially ceased in favor of tradition maintenance. These trends indicate successful stabilization. Counselor Revmoden projected with confident geometric patterns. Or stagnation, Vorth Nil replied quietly. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. In the hierarchy of galactic civilization, stagnation was the unspoken fear that drove many policies. The possibility that their great success might be slowly transforming into terminal decline. Arbitrator Jun Ka's patterns shifted to something approaching determination. The humans invited us to consider whether our achievements represent a destination or a foundation for further development. Lythesena's ribbons flowed through colors indicating complex emotions that had no standard translations. They spoke of growth through fusion rather than preservation of separation. They demonstrated that combining different approaches can create results superior to any individual method. They offered us recipes, Grixtor added with harmonics that carried unexpected warmth. Not as data to be recorded, but as starting points for creating new experiences adapted to our specific needs and circumstances. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions had steadied into something that might have indicated deep thought. Summarize the human's specific proposal for this council. Junka's patterns organized into formal presentation configuration. They propose partnership status rather than tribute membership. They would contribute innovation capabilities, cultural fusion expertise, and what they term impossible problem-solving in exchange for access to galactic technology and resources. Rather than accepting assigned roles, they would identify areas where their capabilities could provide maximum benefit to galactic civilization. And if their contributions prove insufficient to justify partnership status, Counselor Kephalon projected with military precision. They suggested renegotiation rather than enforcement. Vorthnil replied. Their entire approach appears based on the assumption that optimal arrangements emerge through ongoing communication rather than predetermined hierarchy. Counselor Korthprime's quantum communications carried cold calculation. This proposal requires the Council to modify fundamental operational principles based on the suggestions of a single, primitive species. The risk-to-benefit ratio appears unfavorable. Does it? Lytsena's ribbons shifted to challenging goal patterns. What is the risk of allowing one species to attempt voluntary partnership? If they fail to contribute sufficient value, we return to standard procedures. If they succeed, we discover whether our assumptions about optimal organization are correct. The chamber erupted again as species representatives computed the implications of what amounted to the first experimental modification of council policy in recorded history. Some projections indicated minimal risk with potential for significant benefit. Others suggested that any deviation from proven systems could destabilize the entire galactic hierarchy. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions gradually organized into something resembling cautious interest. The proposal presents unprecedented variables. However, the potential for improved understanding of organizational optimization may justify limited experimental implementation. You're suggesting that we accept the humans' proposal? Counselor Revmodin's geometric projections indicated shock. I'm suggesting that we test their proposal under controlled conditions, Vextheron corrected. Limited partnership status for a probationary period. Specific contribution requirements with measurable outcomes. Evaluation of whether voluntary cooperation produces superior results to traditional tribute extraction. Jinka's patterns shifted to rapid excitement. Such an arrangement would require the humans to demonstrate the value of their proposed innovations, and would require us to demonstrate the wisdom of our willingness to consider new approaches, Vorthnil added thoughtfully. Cultural observer Grixtor's harmonic resonance carried notes of anticipation. The human spoke of growth through challenge. This would certainly constitute a significant challenge for both species and council. As the High Assembly moved toward its first non-unanimous decision in several centuries, the implications of humanity's dinner invitation continued to ripple through galactic civilization. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than any in recorded council history. 847 species in favor of experimental partnership, 623 opposed, 124 abstaining. Humanity had achieved something no species before them had accomplished. They had convinced a galactic government to question its own fundamental assumptions. Whether they could prove that their alternative approach actually worked remained to be seen. High Counselor Vextheron's final gravitational emissions carried undertones of both hope and apprehension. Inform the humans that the Council accepts their proposal for experimental partnership, subject to specific performance criteria and ongoing evaluation. And Arbitrator Jinka. Yes, High Counselor. Request additional recipes. If we're going to experiment with human innovation, we should understand all aspects of their approach to transformation. 6 months after the historic dinner that had changed the trajectory of galactic relations, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in what had once been an abandoned mining facility on Proxima Centauri b and was now the testing ground for humanity's most ambitious experiment. The sterile corridors buzzed with activity as human scientists and engineers worked alongside alien specialists who were still adjusting to the concept of collaborative rather than hierarchical research. Status report, Dr. Chun. Elena called to her research partner, a quantum physicist who had somehow become humanity's leading expert on crystalline energy matrices after spending 3 months learning to communicate with Jinka's people. Dr. James Chun looked up from a console that displayed information in 17 different alien languages, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. We've achieved stable resonance between human quantum computing architecture and Viridian crystal arrays. The processing power increase is... He paused, checking his calculations again. Elena, this isn't just an improvement. It's a complete paradigm shift. Around them, the facility hummed with the sound of technologies that shouldn't have been able to work together, but somehow did. Human creativity had found ways to integrate alien innovations that their original designers hadn't considered possible. The results were exceeding everyone's expectations, including humanity's. Technical advisor Lythe Senna flowed into the chamber, its ribbon-like form shifting through colors that Elena had learned to interpret as excitement mixed with bewilderment. Dr. Vasquez, the hybrid propulsion system is demonstrating efficiency rates that exceed our theoretical maximums by 37%. Elena smiled, remembering the early days when the alien representatives had struggled to understand why humans insisted on modifying perfectly functional technology. That's what happens when you combine your precision engineering with our tendency to ask, what if we tried it differently? The past 6 months have been a whirlwind of discovery, frustration, breakthrough, and gradual mutual understanding. The Council had established 3 primary testing areas for the human partnership experiment: technological innovation, resource optimization, and what they carefully termed social coordination challenges. In the technology sector, human researchers had been given access to galactic databases containing millions of years of accumulated scientific knowledge. Instead of simply adopting existing solutions, they had immediately begun identifying ways to combine different approaches, creating hybrid systems that outperformed their individual components. The breakthrough that had surprised everyone, including the humans themselves, came when Dr. Chun suggested merging quantum computing principles with the crystalline energy processing used by Junka's species. The Viridians had developed crystal matrices that could store and manipulate vast amounts of energy with perfect efficiency, but their processing was linear and deterministic. Human quantum computers operated on principles of superposition and probability, allowing them to explore multiple solution paths simultaneously. The crystals provide the stability and energy capacity our quantum systems lack. James explained to cultural observer Grixtor, whose stone form resonated with harmonics, indicating intense interest. Our quantum processing provides the parallel computation capabilities that can utilize the crystal's full potential. And the result is a computing system that is simultaneously more powerful and more efficient than either approach alone, Elena added. It's like the whole becoming genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. Grixtor's harmonic frequency shifted to what Elena had learned indicated philosophical contemplation. This demonstrates the human's fusion principle in practical application. The combination creates novel capabilities that did not exist in either original system. The second testing area, resource optimization, had produced results that were causing heated debates throughout Council space. Humanity's assignment was simple in concept, but revolutionary in implication. Identify ways to improve efficiency in galactic resource allocation systems. The humans had approached this challenge in their typically unconventional manner. Instead of analyzing existing distribution networks for minor improvements, they had questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying resource allocation itself. Dr. Sarah Kim, an economist who had spent her career studying sustainable development, had been the first to propose what became known as the abundance through cooperation model. Standing before a mixed group of human and alien specialists in the facility's main conference room, she outlined concepts that challenged 3,000 years of galactic economic theory. Your current system optimizes for scarcity management, she explained, gesturing to holographic displays showing galactic resource flows. Every decision is based on the assumption that there isn't enough to go around, so the goal is to distribute limited resources as efficiently as possible. Assessor Vorth Nil's branches swayed with what Elena had learned to recognize as engaged attention. This assumption has proven accurate throughout galactic history. Resources are indeed limited. But what if scarcity is partly artificial? Sarah countered. What if the tributary system actually creates inefficiency by incentivizing minimal contribution rather than maximum production? The alien representatives exchanged communications across spectrums Elena couldn't perceive. When they refocused on Sarah, arbitrator Jinka's patterns indicated deep curiosity mixed with skepticism. Elaborate on this assertion. Sarah activated a complex economic model that had taken her team months to develop. Under tribute systems, member species have incentive to meet their required contributions, but no benefit from exceeding them. Additional production simply results in higher tribute assessments. This creates what economists call artificial scarcity, abundance that isn't realized because the system doesn't reward it. You're suggesting that voluntary cooperation would result in increased production? Borth Nil asked. I'm suggesting that species allowed to benefit directly from their increased productivity would have incentive to maximize their contributions rather than minimize them, Sarah replied. Instead of asking, what's the least we can contribute, they would ask, how much can we contribute to maximize our own benefits? The economic modeling that followed proved Sarah's hypothesis correct in ways that astonished everyone involved. When test sectors were allowed to negotiate voluntary contribution agreements rather than having tribute quotas imposed, production increased by an average of 43% within the first quarter. More importantly, innovation rates in those sectors skyrocketed as species began developing new technologies and techniques to increase their production capacity and improve the quality of their contributions. The competition shifted from avoiding higher tribute assessments to developing more valuable offerings for voluntary exchange. The psychological effects are as significant as the economic ones, Dr. Lisa Wong, a social psychologist, reported to the Mixed Evaluation Committee. Species operating under voluntary agreements report higher satisfaction levels, increased cultural creativity, and stronger identification with galactic community goals. Cultural observer Grickstor's harmonic resonance carried notes Elena had never heard before, something that sounded almost like joy. The species are achieving better outcomes while experiencing greater satisfaction with the process? Exactly, Lisa confirmed. When cooperation is voluntary rather than enforced, it becomes a source of pride and accomplishment rather than resentment and resistance. The third testing area, social coordination challenges, have produced the most unexpected results of all. The Council had assigned humanity to several impossible diplomatic situations, conflicts between species that had resisted resolution for centuries. The first case involved the Kethmori, a warrior species, and the Veltar, master builders who have been locked in a territorial dispute over a resource-rich star system for over 400 years. Previous council mediation had failed repeatedly because both species had legitimate but incompatible claims to the system. Ambassador Chun had approached the problem with characteristic human directness. She had invited both species to dinner. I don't understand why you're wasting time with social interaction, Commander Raxcon of the Kethmori had declared, his scaled form radiating the aggressive energy that made his species such effective enforcers. This is a matter of territorial rights, not cultural exchange. Master Builder Thelvass of the Veltar had been equally skeptical, her geometric crystalline form projecting dismissive patterns. Our architectural claims are based on mathematical optimization principles. Consumption rituals cannot modify logical conclusions. Elena, who had been assigned to observe the mediation process, watched Sarah work her diplomatic magic with the same patient persistence that had convinced the council to try partnership in the first place. You're both right, Sarah said simply. This isn't about food, and logic should determine the optimal solution. But what if the problem isn't that you disagree about the facts, but that you're trying to solve the wrong problem? Over the course of 3 meals, because Sarah had learned that important conversations often required multiple courses, she guided both species toward a realization that changed everything. The Kethmori needed the system's rare metals for their military technology. The Veltar needed the system's unique geometric properties for their architectural projects. Both species had been fighting for exclusive control when what they actually needed was cooperative access. Why hadn't anyone suggested shared utilization before? Commander Raxcon asked after the breakthrough moment when both sides realized they could achieve their goals more effectively through collaboration than competition. Because the Council's standard approach is to determine which claimant has stronger rights and award them exclusive control, Sarah explained. We humans have a tendency to ask whether the conflict might be based on a false premise. The solution that emerged, joint development with the Kethmori handling system defense, while the Veltar managed resource extraction, produced better outcomes for both species than either could have achieved through exclusive control. More importantly, It established a precedent for resolving conflicts through creative cooperation rather than authoritarian arbitration. 6 months into the experimental partnership, the results spoke for themselves. Every testing area had demonstrated that human approaches could generate superior outcomes to traditional council methods. Technology innovation had accelerated dramatically. Resource production had increased across all test sectors. Diplomatic conflicts that had seemed intractable were being resolved through creative cooperation. But the most significant change wasn't in the measurable outcomes. It was in the alien representatives themselves. Elena watched technical advisor Lythsena experimenting with food combinations in the facility's break room, its ribbons shifting through color patterns that indicated pure curiosity rather than analytical assessment. Cultural observer Grixtor had started incorporating human musical concepts into its harmonic communications, creating beauty for its own sake rather than just conveying information efficiently. Even arbitrator Junka had begun asking questions that went beyond its original assessment protocols. During their weekly evaluation meetings, it would inquire about human art, philosophy, and the general concept of finding meaning through experiences that serve no practical purpose. The partnership experiment is demonstrating that efficiency and optimization may not be synonymous, Junka admitted during one of these conversations. Human approaches achieve better results through methods our calculations suggest should be less effective. Maybe that's because your calculations are optimizing for the wrong variables, Elena suggested. You're measuring efficiency in terms of resource utilization and outcome achievement. We're optimizing for satisfaction, innovation, and long-term adaptability. Junka's patterns shifted to something Elena had learned to interpret as deep thought. Are you suggesting that immediate efficiency can compromise long-term effectiveness? I'm suggesting that systems optimized purely for efficiency tend to become brittle, Elena replied. They work perfectly under predicted conditions, but can adapt when circumstances change. Human systems are designed to be robust rather than optimal. They might be less efficient in the short term, but they're more adaptable in the long term. As the 6-month evaluation period drew to a close, Elena realized that the partnership experiment had become something larger than anyone had anticipated. Humanity hadn't just proven that alternative approaches could work. They had demonstrated that the galaxy's greatest strength wasn't its stability, but its potential for growth. The question now was whether galactic civilization was ready to embrace change as a fundamental principle rather than an occasional necessity. The answer would determine not just humanity's future, but the trajectory of every species in the galaxy. 2 years after humanity's experimental partnership began, Ambassador Sarachun stood before the largest gathering in galactic history. The Grand Assembly had been convened not for routine administrative purposes, but to address a fundamental question that was reshaping civilization across 37 sectors. Should the principles demonstrated by the human partnership become the foundation for an entirely new form of galactic organization? The statistics were undeniable. The sectors that had adopted voluntary cooperation models were outproducing traditional tribute systems by an average of 68%. Innovation rates had increased by over 200%. Most remarkably, interspecies conflicts had dropped to their lowest levels in recorded history as species discovered that their differences could be sources of strength rather than division. But numbers alone hadn't convinced the Council to consider transformation. The real catalyst had been the emergence of what historians would later call the Great Awakening, a spontaneous movement among member species who had experienced the new approaches and refused to return to the old systems. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions carried undertones of marvel as it addressed the Assembly. The Council convenes this session to address unprecedented circumstances. For the first time in our recorded history, member species are requesting modification of their assigned roles and tribute obligations, not in isolated cases, but as a galaxy-wide phenomenon. Sarah looked out across the vast chamber, now filled with representatives who no longer sat in rigid hierarchical arrangements, but in mixed groups that reflected their collaborative working relationships. The sight of Kethmori warriors brainstorming with Veltar architects, of crystalline energy beings sharing innovations with silicon-based mathematicians, would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. Arbitrator Junka, whose role had evolved from assessment administrator to partnership coordinator, activated holographic displays showing the transformation. The human partnership model has demonstrated that voluntary cooperation generates superior outcomes across all measured criteria. However, implementing these principles galaxy-wide would require fundamental restructuring of our governmental and economic systems. Counselor Kephalon, whose military enforcement species had initially been most resistant to change, projected patterns that indicated grudging acknowledgement. The efficiency improvements are undeniable. However, stability concerns remain significant. The current system has maintained order for 3 millennia. Change of this magnitude introduces unknown variables. Unknown variables like continued growth instead of slow stagnation. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been invited to present humanity's perspective on the proposed transformation. Like species discovering capabilities they never knew they possessed. Like the possibility that galactic civilization's greatest achievements are still ahead of us rather than behind us. She gestured to the mixed species teams scattered throughout the chamber. Look around this assembly. 3 years ago, these beings were organized into rigid hierarchies based on predetermined roles. Now, they're collaborating on projects that none of their species could have conceived individually. They're not just more efficient, they're more creative, more innovative, more alive. Technical advisor Lythsena, whose ribbon-like form now displayed color patterns that had no equivalent in its species' original emotional spectrum, flowed forward to address the assembly. The transformation extends beyond economic and political structures. The partnership model has generated new forms of consciousness, new ways of experiencing existence that transcend individual species limitations. Elaborate, requested Counselor Revmoden, whose geometric projections indicated intense interest despite historical resistance to change. Art, Grixtor replied, simply, its harmonic resonance creating musical frequencies that resonated through the chamber. Beauty created for its own sake rather than functional purpose. Cultural fusion that generates novel experiences none of our species had imagined. The discovery that existence can be enriched through cooperation rather than just optimized through hierarchy. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed implications that went far beyond policy modifications. What was being proposed wasn't just governmental reform. It was the acceptance that their entire understanding of optimal existence might be fundamentally incomplete. Sarah stepped forward, knowing that her next words would either open unprecedented possibilities or create the conditions for galactic civil war. Honorable representatives, we're not here to convince you to abandon your achievements. 3,000 years of peace and prosperity represent remarkable success. We're here to ask whether you're satisfied with success or whether you're willing to discover what comes after success. She activated her own holographic display, showing comparative data from the past 2 years. Every metric you've traditionally used to measure galactic health has improved under voluntary cooperation models. But, more importantly, new metrics have emerged that we never thought to measure before. Happiness, creativity, the sense of meaning that comes from contributing to something greater than survival. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions had shifted to frequencies Sarah had learned indicated deep contemplation. Ambassador Chun, you speak of transformation as though it were inherently beneficial. However, change also carries risk of loss. What guarantee can you provide that voluntary systems will maintain the stability that tribute systems have ensured? None, Sarah replied honestly. But what guarantee can you provide that stagnation won't eventually lead to decline? Systems that don't grow tend to decay. Civilizations that stop adapting tend to become vulnerable to challenges they haven't anticipated. She paused, then continued with the conviction that had driven humanity's entire approach to galactic relations. We can't guarantee that voluntary cooperation will solve every future challenge, but we can prove that it generates the innovation and adaptability necessary to meet unknown challenges as they arise. Assessor Vorthnil's branches moved in patterns that indicated approval mixed with concern. The philosophical implications are as significant as the practical ones. Voluntary cooperation requires trust in the fundamental good intentions of other species. 3 millennia of hierarchical control have created stability partly by removing the need for such trust. And look what we've missed because of that, Dr. Lisa Wong interjected, stepping forward to address the assembly. Trust isn't just necessary for voluntary cooperation. It's the foundation for every form of meaningful relationship. When species trust each other, they share their best innovations rather than hiding them. They collaborate on solving common challenges rather than competing for limited resources. She activated a display showing the social and psychological impacts of the partnership experiments. Fear-based systems create fear-based outcomes. Species focused on avoiding punishment tend to achieve minimal compliance. Trust-based systems create trust-based outcomes. Species focused on maximizing contribution tend to exceed their own expectations. Cultural observer Grigstor's harmonic frequencies had shifted to something that sounded almost like laughter. The humans have demonstrated that our greatest limitation was not technological or resource-based, but imaginational. We had stopped believing that better outcomes were possible. Because improvement requires admitting that current conditions are suboptimal, Sarah added. And admitting suboptimality feels like acknowledging failure rather than recognizing opportunity. The debate that followed would continue for 7 standard days, with representatives from hundreds of species weighing the implications of transformation against the security of familiar systems. Some argued for gradual implementation. Others insisted that half measures would compromise the benefits of full cooperation. A few species threatened to withdraw from council membership rather than abandon hierarchical tribute systems. But the decisive moment came when Counselor Korth Prime, whose hive mind species had been among the most efficiency-focused in the galaxy, shared a revelation that surprised everyone, including itself. The hive mind operates through perfect cooperation because individual components trust the collective wisdom absolutely. It communicated through quantum entanglement that translated as profound insight. We have been applying cooperative principles internally while maintaining competitive principles externally. The humans have shown us that external cooperation can generate collective wisdom that exceeds any individual species' capabilities. You're saying that galactic civilization could operate like a vast hive mind, but composed of diverse species rather than identical components? Borth Nil asked with obvious fascination. Not identical components, Korth Prime corrected. Complementary capabilities. Each species contributing their unique strengths while benefiting from others' innovations. Unity through diversity rather than uniformity through control. The final vote, when it came, reflected the transformation that had already occurred throughout the galaxy. 1,247 species voted to implement voluntary cooperation as the new foundation for galactic organization. 156 voted to maintain traditional tribute systems. 43 abstained, requesting time to observe outcomes before committing. High Counselor Vextheron's gravitational emissions carried unprecedented harmonics as it announced the result. By overwhelming majority, the Galactic Council accepts the transformation proposal. Implementation will begin immediately with voluntary adoption and gradual transition support for all member species. As the assembly dissolved into celebration, another human innovation that had spread throughout galactic culture, Sarah found herself surrounded by alien representatives who had become genuine friends rather than just diplomatic contacts. Ambassador Chun Junka's patterns indicated something Sarah had never seen before, joy mixed with gratitude. Your species has given us something we did not know we were missing. What's that? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Hope, Lythe Senna replied, its ribbons flowing through colors that had no names in any galactic language. The knowledge that tomorrow can be better than today, not through chance, but through choice. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the same courtyard where humanity's first dinner with alien representatives had taken place. The space had been transformed into a permanent embassy and cultural exchange center, where species from across the galaxy came not to pay tribute or receive assignments, but to share innovations and explore possibilities. The menu for the evening's celebration included dishes from 47 different species, each adapted through collaborative experimentation to be enjoyable from multiple physiologies. The conversations range from quantum architecture to interspecies poetry, from resource optimization to the philosophy of voluntary existence. Chef Maria Santos, now director of the Galactic Culinary Exchange Program, emerged from the kitchen with a smile that reflected the satisfaction of dreams achieved beyond imagination. Ambassador, the Altarian crystal fruit souffle is finally stable in Earth atmosphere. We're ready to serve the first truly galactic dinner. Sarah looked around at the gathering, representatives of dozens of species talking, laughing, sharing ideas and food, and the simple pleasure of voluntary association. 3 years earlier, Earth had been an isolated planet facing an ultimatum from powers beyond human comprehension. Now, humanity had become the catalyst for the largest voluntary transformation in galactic history. You know what the best part is? Sarah said to Maria as they watched a Kethmori warrior teaching cooking techniques to a Veltar architect, while a crystalline energy being provided harmonic accompaniment to their conversation. What's that? Sarah smiled, remembering the moment when she'd first suggested partnership instead of tribute. We're just getting started. This isn't the end of human innovation. It's the beginning of galactic innovation. And there's no telling what we'll discover when every species in the galaxy is free to contribute their best ideas instead of just meeting their minimum obligations. Above them, the stars shone with the light of 1,000 worlds where beings were discovering that existence could be more than survival, that cooperation could generate abundance, and that the greatest tribute any species could offer was the gift of their unique perspective on the endless possibilities of life among the stars. The Galactic Council had asked for tribute, and humanity's response had indeed shattered expectations. But the real surprise wasn't humanity's refusal to pay tribute. It was their demonstration that tribute had never been necessary in the first place. What the galaxy needed wasn't submission to authority, but invitation to partnership. Not efficiency through control, but innovation through trust. And as the first truly voluntary galactic civilization took its initial steps toward an uncertain but hopeful future, the universe itself seemed to expand with new possibilities that no single species could have imagined alone.